I am greatly amused by Anthony Ferris 8912, who says, "What's this? What's this? Farage, Tim's antichrist politician, says it's essential for Ukraine to join NATO." Well, I think when somebody says something, whether you agree with them, whether you dislike them or not, if they say something right, you want to salute it and you want to uh, encourage people to hear that they've seen some sense. And I don't normally agree with what Farage says because the evidence points to the fact that Farage is looking for another headline and another bit of disruption. But I think in this particular case, he's absolutely right. There are, I think, 5 good reasons why Ukraine should join NATO. First of all, security and deterrence. NATO would provide Ukraine with collective security under Article 5, deterring future Russian aggression by ensuring that an attack on NATO is an attack understood to be on all NATO members. And even if the US doesn't want to support Europe, unless the US withdraws from NATO, that remains for the US as well. Despite whatever threats Trump is making, Trump would have to withdraw from NATO, not just ignore the threat to Europe by Russia. Given Russia's repeated violations of Ukrainian sovereignty since 2014, Ukraine seeks a security guarantee stronger than the temporary ceasefires or the diplomatic agreements, or Minsk I, Minsk II, which have had no efficacious value. And that is partly why Zelensky, I suspect, was so keen to nullify them. The second point, that this would prevent future invasions, since Ukraine has been under continuous attack by Russia and its proxies, the ghost troops and the private militias. NATO membership would prevent future wars by firmly integrating NATO within the Western security framework. And it's been 12 years of constant tension and constant fighting. And Russia has repeatedly justified its aggression by portraying Ukraine as a buffer state, and NATO membership would remove this ambiguity. The third point, that this would strengthen the NATO alliance, and Ukraine has demonstrated significant military capabilities and strategic importance, particularly in countering hybrid warfare, cyber threats and drone warfare, areas where NATO can benefit from Ukrainian expertise. The fourth point, that joining NATO would accelerate Ukraine's integration into Western economic and sort of political structures, further solidifying democratic institutions and aligning Ukraine with with European political norms. And the fifth and most important issue is the moral and the historical justification, given the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which people who are so keen on the Minsk agreements tend to forget, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the US and the UK, which was Russia violated in 2014. And Ukraine's NATO membership can be seen as a necessary corrective measure, because the Budapest Memorandum didn't work. The Minsk I, Minsk II didn't work. And what is a common feature of the last 12 years is Russian aggression. There are people who've urged Ukraine to join NATO other than Farage. George W. Bush in 2008 strongly supported Ukraine's membership action plan. Joe Biden and other American officials have continued to advocate for eventual membership. The NATO Secretary Jean Stoltenberg repeatedly stated that Ukraine would become a member when it met the necessary criteria. European leaders, Polish, Baltic, Scandinavian leaders have consistently supported Ukraine's NATO bid, recognizing the security risks of a Russian-dominated Eastern Europe. And Presidents Petro Poroshenko and Zelensky have been vocal proponents of the NATO integration, with Zelensky pushing for a clear timeline. One of the Russian core claims is that NATO has promised not to expand eastward after the Cold War, but there's no formal agreement to support this assertion. The claim goes back to informal discussions in 1990 between the US Secretary of State James Baker and the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev during the German reunification talks. And Baker reportedly said that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, apparently, in reference to Eastern Germany's NATO status post-reunification. But no legally binding document exists that prevents NATO enlargement beyond Germany. And if this was a verbal agreement, there isn't a clear record of that either. The final treaties, including the 2+4 agreement in 1990, make no reference at all to restrictions on NATO's future expansion. So this is fantasy propaganda put forward by Russia and the Russian trolls. Why is there no evidence? Diplomatic conversations and verbal assurances are not legally binding, first of all, even if they took place. Gorbachev himself later stated in a 2014 interview that no formal promise was made preventing NATO enlargement. So the point with the trolls is they're remembering one Gorbachev story and not the other. And NATO's expansion occurred because former Soviet bloc countries applied for membership because of their fear of Russian aggression. And that fear has been justified in what Russia has done to Ukraine. Not because NATO imposed its presence, not because of NATO creep. And why does Russia insist on this odd narrative, this selective memory of what Gorbachev might have been involved in discussing? Because it serves as a political justification for Russian opposition to NATO itself. It helps to frame Russia as a victim of Western betrayal, as a victim, despite the fact that many Eastern European nations have actively sought NATO protection from Russian aggression. So what were the Minsk treaties? What were the Minsk agreements? In 2014 and 2015, a ceasefire brokered by the OSCE, that's Ukraine, Russia, and the Russian-backed separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. It failed quickly because of continual fighting. Minsk II, a revised agreement that included provisions for a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, autonomy for Donetsk and Luhansk, and the constitutional reform in Ukraine. Again, it's failed because of Russian aggression. So why was Minsk ineffectual? It was ineffectual because there was continued Russian interference. Russia never fully withdrew its troops or its support for the separatists. Indeed, that support was buttressed by the active involvement of Wagner and other paramilitary groups and these private armies. The agreement forced Ukraine into negotiations with illegitimate Russian-backed separatists, and Minsk allowed Russia to maintain a foothold in Ukraine while avoiding full-scale military defeat. Zelensky's position, he's always expressed skepticism about Minsk, arguing that it doesn't stop Russian aggression but merely delays the inevitable conflict. And that is why he is suspicious of some of the proposals which are coming out in the name of Trump. Russia's continuous war against Ukraine from 2014 to the present has involved hybrid warfare, proxy militias. Russia has used grey zone tactics, unofficial troops, mercenaries like the Wagner Group, and cyber warfare to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty without formal declarations of war. And even the war which is ongoing at the moment is not backed up by a formal declaration of war. It's a special military operation. The Crimean annexation in 2014, I was in Russia when that took place, and Russian forces took over Crimea, violating the 1994 Budapest Memorandum and the UN Charter. The so-called separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk were organized, funded, and armed by Russia. And Russia has escalated from proxy warfare to open invasion, confirming that the Minsk agreements were never a real solution. So the trolls need to go back and start doing their history before they constantly witter on about Minsk, because Minsk is irrelevant. Minsk has been proven to be ineffective by Russia. Ukraine's NATO membership is necessary to ensure its long-term security and prevent Russian aggression, and to prevent Russian aggression getting through to the rest of Europe. The claim of a NATO non-expansion promise lacks evidence and was never anyway legally binding. The Minsk agreements were ineffective and largely served Russia's interests. These were agreements brokered effectively at the point of a gun. And Ukraine has been under attack for at least 12 years, proving that agreements without security guarantees do not work. NATO expansion is not the provocation. that Russia claims it to be. In the same way, the nonsense about Nazi Russia and about purifying Ukraine, this Orthodox crusade, all of this is nonsense. All of this is an attempt to justify the greed and the invasion by Putin. Putin needs to go back into the fridge and start reading up the small print on the bottom of the popsicles, because he hasn't done his homework. And while there are trolls who are going to be chomping around the place and scattering their seeds of discontent here, there, and everywhere, take it from me, the Minsk stuff is rubbish. And the claim about Gorbachev brokering a deal that NATO would not expand eastwards is rubbish.